The auctioneer's voice, a gravelly drone amplified by a crackling speaker, echoed across the dusty pens of the Blackwood Livestock Exchange. It was a place of endings and beginnings, where fortunes were made and lost on the twitch of a bidder's finger. But on this blistering August afternoon, it felt only like a place of endings, especially for the creature standing alone in the far corner of the rejection pen. He was a bison, a magnificent wreck of an animal, a living monument to a forgotten era. His massive frame, which should have inspired awe, was instead a canvas of neglect and hardship. His coat, the color of scorched earth, was matted and patchy, revealing scarred hide beneath. One of his horns was broken, a jagged stump that gave his already imposing head a lopsided, tragic appearance. He stood with his head hung low, the great hump on his shoulders seeming less a symbol of power and more a heavy burden of sorrow. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The other ranchers, men with faces weathered by sun and skepticism, leaned against the metal railings, their conversations a low murmur of derision. "Look at that old beast," one said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the parched ground. "Good for nothing but dog food. They'll be lucky to get $100 for him." His companion chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "100? I wouldn't. Give 50, probably diseased. Look at the way he's favoring that back leg." They saw only a liability, a wasted investment, a ghost from a wilder time that had no place in their world of calculated yields and genetic breeding lines. They couldn't see the intelligence that still flickered in the bison's dark, deep-set eyes, an ancient wisdom that watched their posturing with a weary resignation. He had seen their kind for generations, men who measured life in dollars and cents, and he had long ago learned that their world had little room for a creature like him. But in the small crowd, standing near the back, was one man who saw something different. Elias Vance, at 72, felt a kinship with the rejected animal. His own life felt like it was in a rejection pen. A year had passed since he had buried his wife, Martha, and with her, he had buried the heart of his world. The sprawling ranch that had been in his family for 3 generations was gone, sold off to pay for medical bills and mounting debts. All that remained was a small 10-acre plot of marginal land, a place he now called home, but which felt more like an exile. His hands, once strong and capable of mending any fence or calming any nervous calf, were now knotted with arthritis. His shoulders, like the bison's, were stooped, not from age alone, but from the weight of grief and loneliness. When he looked at the bison, he didn't see a worthless beast. He saw a reflection of his own soul. He saw pride that refused to be extinguished by suffering, a strength that endured despite visible weakness, and a profound loneliness that mirrored his own. The auctioneer finally turned his attention to the rejection pen, his voice dripping with a mixture of pity and impatience. "All right, folks, what am I bid for this old bull? A real piece of American history here, though his best days are behind him. Let's start the bidding at $100. Do I hear 100? Silence. The other ranchers shook their heads, turning away to look at more promising stock. The only sound was the buzzing of flies and the distant lowing of cattle. $100, folks, just to get him out of here," the auctioneer pleaded, his professional pride stung by the utter lack of interest. "Come on, someone give the old boy a home." Elias felt a pull, a quiet but insistent voice in his heart that he hadn't heard since Martha died. It was the voice of purpose, the whisper of a reason to get up in the morning. Before he could talk himself out of it, before he could remember his meager savings and the vet bills that would surely follow, he raised a trembling hand. 100, he called out, his voice thin but clear in the sudden stillness. Heads turned. The other ranchers stared at him with open disbelief, their expressions a mixture of pity and scorn for the old fool wasting his money. The auctioneer blinked, surprised. I've got $100 from Mr. Vance. Do I hear 150? 110? More silence. The other men were already losing interest, shaking their heads at Elias's sentimentality. Sold, the auctioneer cried, banging his gavel with a loud crack that seemed to finalize the transfer of one lost soul to another. For $100 to Elias Vance. As Elias walked toward the loading chute to claim his new companion, the whispers followed him. Poor old Elias, lost his wife, lost his ranch, and now it seems he's lost his mind too. But Elias didn't hear them. He was focused on the bison, who had lifted his massive head for the first time, his dark eyes locking onto the man who had just saved him from an ignominious end. In that shared gaze, a silent understanding passed between them, a fragile pact. Between two beings who had been written off by the world. Have you ever felt an inexplicable connection to a creature in pain? A pull to help even when it seemed illogical or foolish, knowing in your heart that some bonds are forged in a place beyond reason? The journey back to Elias's small plot of land was a slow, deliberate affair. The old bison, whom Elias decided to call Kale, a name that felt as ancient and strong as the animal himself, walked into the rickety trailer with a surprising lack of resistance, as if he understood that this was his last chance. The 10-acre property was a shadow of the sprawling ranch Elias had once managed. The fences were sagging, the barn was in need of a new roof, and the pasture was overgrown with weeds instead of the rich alfalfa Kale was likely used to. It was a place of quiet decay, a perfect match for its two new inhabitants. Elias led Kale into the pasture, and the great beast stood for a long time, surveying his new humble surroundings. He didn't graze, he didn't move. He simply stood, a dark statue of sorrow, his head hanging low. Elias brought him a bucket of fresh water and a bundle of the best hay he could afford, but Kale ignored them both. The local veterinarian, Dr. Evans, a pragmatic woman in her 40s, came by that evening. She examined Kale with a practiced eye, her expression growing more troubled with each passing moment. "Elias, what have you done?" she asked, her tone gentle but firm. "He's severely malnourished. He's got a nasty infection in that leg, and based on the look of his teeth, he's well over 15 years old. That's ancient for a bison." She ran her hands over his scarred hide, her face a mask of professional concern. "He's been through hell. Those scars aren't from other bison. Some of these look like they were made by men. He's been abused, Elias. Deeply traumatized." Elias's heart ached. "Can you help him, Doc?" Dr. Evans sighed, a sound of weary compassion. "I can give him antibiotics for the infection and some supplements for the malnutrition. But the rest? Elias, the kind of damage he's carrying isn't just physical. He's given up. In my experience, when an animal loses the will to live, there's not much medicine can do." She left him with a list of instructions and a bill that made. Elias's stomach clenched, but her final words lingered in the air long after she was gone. "Don't get your hopes up. Sometimes the kindest thing is just to provide a peaceful place for them to pass." For the next week, it seemed Dr. Evans's grim prognosis would prove true. Kale stood in the same spot, a sentinel of despair. He refused all food, drank little water, and seemed to shrink with each passing day. Elias spent hours with him, not trying to force him to eat, but simply talking to him. He sat on an overturned bucket just outside the fence, his voice a low, soothing murmur, telling the bison stories about his life, about Martha, about the ranch he had lost. "She would have loved you, big fella," Elias said one afternoon, his voice thick with memory. "Martha had a way with broken things. She could make anything grow, could mend any broken spirit. She always said the most beautiful things in life were the ones that had to fight the hardest to survive." Kale's ears, tattered and scarred, twitched at the sound of Elias's voice, the first sign of life the old man had seen. He continued talking, pouring out the loneliness and grief he had kept bottled inside for a year. The bison became his confessor, his silent companion in sorrow. He spoke of his regrets, his fears for the future, and his deep, abiding love for the woman who was gone. The old beast just listened, his dark eyes watching Elias with an unnerving stillness. A breakthrough came on the 8th day. Elias had brought out a small bucket of warm oats mixed with molasses, a trick Martha had used for sick calves. He set it on the ground and sat in his usual spot, not expecting anything. But after an hour of Elias's quiet storytelling, Cale took a hesitant step forward, then another. He slowly approached the bucket, sniffing it cautiously before taking a small tentative mouthful. Elias held his breath, not daring to move. Cale ate another bite, then another, until the bucket was empty. He then lifted his head, looked directly at Elias, and let out a soft, low rumble from deep within his chest. It wasn't a roar of aggression, but a sound of acknowledgement, a fragile bridge being built across the chasm of their mutual pain. If you've ever felt the profound healing that comes from caring for another being, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Stories like these remind us that purpose can be found in the most unexpected places. And sometimes, in saving another, we end up saving ourselves. From that day forward, the bond between the old man and the old bison began to solidify. Cale's physical health improved slowly but surely. The antibiotics fought off the infection in his leg, and with a steady diet of quality hay and oats, he began to regain his strength. His coat started to lose its matted appearance, and the deep sadness in his eyes was gradually replaced by a quiet curiosity. He started to follow Elias around the pasture, his massive head just over the fence, his presence a constant, reassuring shadow. But just as a fragile hope began to bloom on the small farm, a new threat emerged. Arthur Davenport, a wealthy land developer who owned the adjacent property, had been eyeing Elias's 10 acres for months. He saw it not as a home but as an undeveloped asset, a perfect location to expand his sprawling estate. He had made several offers, all of which Elias had politely refused. Davenport, a man unaccustomed to being told no, saw Elias's new acquisition as an opportunity. He arrived one morning in a gleaming luxury SUV that looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of the rustic farm. "Vance," he said, foregoing any pleasantries as he gestured toward Cale with a dismissive wave of his hand, "I heard you bought yourself a mascot. A rather dangerous-looking one, at that. You realize the liability you're taking on? An animal that size gets loose, it could cause serious damage. To my property, for instance." Elias stood his ground. "He's no trouble, Arthur. He stays in his pasture." Davenport's smile was thin and predatory, for now, but I've been talking to the county. They have regulations about keeping exotic and potentially dangerous livestock, especially on a property that isn't properly zoned or fenced for it. One phone call from me, and you'll have animal control out here so fast, it'll make your head spin. They'll confiscate him, of course, and we both know what happens to an animal like that. The threat was clear. Davenport was leveraging the bison to force Elias to sell. "What do you want, Arthur?" "The same thing I've always wanted. Your land. I'll make you a final offer, a generous one, considering the state of this place. Take it, and I'll forget I ever saw this beast. Refuse, and I'll make sure you lose him anyway." The ultimatum hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Elias looked from Davenport's smug face to Cale, who was watching their interaction with an intelligent gaze. The bison seemed to understand the threat, positioning his massive body slightly in front of Elias, a subtle act of protection. Elias felt a surge of defiance he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about 10 acres of land anymore. It was about protecting the one thing that had given him a reason to live again. "The land is not for sale, Arthur," Elias said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "Not now, not ever." Davenport's face hardened. "You'll regret this, old man," he sneered before climbing back into his SUV and speeding away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. That evening, as a storm brewed on the horizon, Elias felt a deep sense of dread. He was a poor old farmer, and Davenport was a rich, powerful man with connections. It was an unfair fight. He was checking the fence line, reinforcing a weak spot Cale had surprisingly nudged him towards earlier that day, when the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The wind howled, and the sky opened up in a torrential downpour. Elias rushed toward the small barn, but a sudden violent gust of wind tore a loose piece of roofing tin from its moorings. The metal sheet cartwheeled through the air, striking Elias in the head. He crumpled to the ground, a searing pain shooting through his skull as darkness enveloped him. He lay there, unconscious, as the storm raged around him, the rain soaking him to the bone. No one knew he was there. No one was coming to help, but he was not alone. Cale, who had taken shelter under a thick grove of oak trees, saw his friend fall. The great Bison, who had every reason to fear storms and the chaos of nature, did something extraordinary. He left his shelter and walked out into the heart of the tempest. He approached Elias's prone form, nudging him gently with his massive head. When Elias didn't stir, Cale let out a bellow that was not of fear or anger, but a desperate, urgent call for help. When no help came, Cale stood over Elias's body, shielding him from the worst of the wind and rain with his own immense frame, a living, breathing shelter for the man who had shown him kindness. He remained there all night, a steadfast guardian against the storm, refusing to leave his friend's side. What drives an animal, once traumatized and abused, to show such profound loyalty and protection? Is it instinct, or is it something more? A form of love and gratitude that we are only beginning to understand. Dawn broke, painting the storm-ravaged landscape in hues of gray and soft lavender. Elias awoke to a dull throbbing ache in his head and the strange sensation of a warm, heavy weight beside him. He opened his eyes to find himself looking directly into the dark, intelligent eye of Cale. The massive Bison was lying on the ground. Beside him, a posture so unnatural for a wild animal that it took Elias's breath away. Cale had remained by his side all night, a silent, unmoving vigil. Slowly, painfully, Elias pushed himself into a sitting position. His head swam in a wave of dizziness washed over him. Cale let out a soft rumble, nudging Elias's shoulder gently as if to steady him. "You stayed with me," Elias whispered, his voice hoarse. He reached out a trembling hand and laid it on the Bison's thick, damp fur. "You saved me, you big, stubborn old fool." The bond between them, already strong, was now forged in the crucible of shared adversity. It was a bond that transcended species, a covenant of mutual protection. When Dr. Evans arrived later that morning, having been unable to get through the washed-out roads the night before, she found a scene that defied all her medical training. Elias was sitting up, leaning against Cale's massive side, while the Bison contentedly chewed his cud. After examining Elias and stitching the gash on his head, she turned her attention to Cale. "His recovery is astonishing, Elias," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "His leg is almost completely healed. He's gained at least 200 pounds, and his coat is starting to look healthy. But this," she gestured to the two of them, "this is the best medicine of all. You two have healed each other." News of the incident spread through the small rural community. The story of the old man and the rejected Bison who had become each other's saviors became a local legend. People who had once pitied Elias as a sentimental old fool now looked at him with. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A new respect. They saw not a man who had lost his mind, but a man who had followed his heart and found something precious. Even Arthur Davenport was affected by the story, though he would never admit it publicly. His campaign of harassment ceased. There were no more calls to animal control, no more veiled threats. He still wanted the land, but he seemed to have realized that Elias Vance was not a man who could be easily intimidated. As the months passed, Cale's transformation continued. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a thriving, magnificent creature. The full power and majesty of his being began to emerge. But with his physical recovery came the revelation of his other, more mysterious abilities. Elias noticed it in small ways at first. Cale would often stare intently at a particular part of the pasture, and days later, a coyote or a stray dog would be seen in that exact spot. He seemed to have an uncanny ability to sense the presence of other creatures long before they were visible. One afternoon, Elias was working in the small vegetable garden he had planted, a garden that was now flourishing thanks to the rich fertilizer Cale provided. Suddenly, Cale began to act agitated. He paced the fence line, his eyes fixed on the distant hills, letting out low, guttural rumbles. The sky was clear, the sun was shining, and there was no apparent reason for his distress. "What is it, boy?" Elias asked, leaning on his shovel. "What's got you so worked up?" Cale ignored him, his attention focused solely on the horizon. Few hours later, the reason for his anxiety became terrifyingly clear. A faint haze appeared on the horizon, soon followed by the unmistakable smell of smoke. A wildfire, sparked by a lightning strike in the dry backcountry miles away, was being driven toward them by a sudden shift in the wind. Elias's blood ran cold. The fire was moving with incredible speed, a rolling wave of orange and black devouring everything in its path. His small farm lay directly in its line of advance. Panic set in. He needed to get Cale into the trailer, but in the chaos, he couldn't find the keys to his old truck. The smoke grew thicker, stinging his eyes and choking his lungs. The roar of the fire was a deafening, monstrous sound. Just as despair began to wash over him, he saw Arthur Davenport's SUV careening down the dirt road. But Davenport wasn't coming to help. He was fleeing, his face pale with terror. In his haste, he took a turn too fast, and the heavy vehicle skidded off the road, crashing into a deep ditch. Elias saw the developer try to open his door, but it was jammed shut. He was trapped. The fire was now just a few hundred yards away. The heat so intense it felt like standing in front of an open furnace. There was no time. There was no escape. He and his arrogant neighbor were both going to die, but Cale had other plans. The great Bison, who should have been panicking, was a picture of calm resolve. He walked over to the pasture gate and with a powerful thrust of his massive head, shattered the thick wooden beams as if they were matchsticks. He was free. He came to Elias, nudging him urgently, not away from the fire, but parallel to it, toward a rocky, barren creek bed that Elias had always considered a useless part of his property. "What are you doing, Cale?" Elias cried, his voice lost in the roar, but he trusted the animal. He stumbled after the bison, his lungs burning, the heat blistering his skin. Cale led him into the creek bed, a shallow, rocky channel that was mostly dry. Then, he did something that defied all logic. He began to run, not away from the fire, but straight toward Davenport's trapped vehicle. He reached the SUV and lowered his head, positioning his immense strength against the rear of the vehicle. With a heave that seemed to draw power from the very earth, he pushed. Metal groaned, and the SUV lurched forward, out of the ditch and back onto the road. Davenport, stunned, managed to get the engine started and sped away without a backward glance. Cale then turned back to Elias and nudged him further down the creek bed. They huddled together behind a large rock outcropping as the main wall of fire swept over them, the heat and sound a hellish, overwhelming force. The creek bed, barren of fuel, acted as a natural fire break, and the flames passed over them, leaving a blackened, smoldering world in their wake. When the inferno had passed, leaving behind a surreal silence broken only by the crackle of cooling embers, Elias stood up, his body shaking, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. He was alive. He looked at Cale, whose thick fur was singed, but who was otherwise unharmed. The bison had not only saved his life, but had also saved the life of the man who had tried to destroy them. The worthless, rejected animal had proven to be the savior of them all. What does it mean for our understanding of the world when an animal we've written off as simple or without value displays a level of intelligence, courage, and forgiveness that surpasses our own? The aftermath of the fire was a scene of apocalyptic devastation. The landscape was a uniform black, the trees' skeletal fingers reaching toward a smoke-filled sky. Elias's small barn was gone, his fences were vaporized, and his house, though still standing, was badly damaged. Yet, amidst the destruction, he and Cale had survived. They were an island of life in a sea of ash. As the sun tried to break through the hazy sky, a convoy of emergency vehicles made its way slowly up the road. Firefighters, police, and paramedics were stunned to find the old man and his bison standing calmly in the middle of the blackened wasteland. The story of their survival, and of Cale's incredible heroism, spread like the fire itself. It was the lead story on the local news, then regional, and within days, it had become a national phenomenon. The image of the massive bison standing guard over the old farmer was broadcast across the country, a powerful symbol of resilience and interspecies devotion. Arthur Davenport, humbled and ashamed, was among the first visitors. He approached Elias not with arrogance, but with a deep, newfound respect. "Vance." "Elias," he began, his voice uncharacteristically soft. I don't know what to say your animal. He saved my life. After everything I did, everything I threatened. He saved me." Elias simply nodded, placing a hand on Cale's broad back. "Cale doesn't hold grudges, Arthur. He just sees a life in need." The developer looked at the bison, truly seeing him for the first time. He saw not a liability, but a hero. "I was wrong," Davenport said, his voice thick with emotion. "About everything. I want to help you rebuild. Whatever you need, a new barn, new fences, a new house, it's yours. Consider it a down payment on the debt I can never fully repay." True to his word, Davenport funded the entire reconstruction of the farm. But this time, it was built not just for an old man, but for a legendary bison. A state-of-the-art barn was erected. The fences were made of reinforced steel, and a special irrigation system was installed to bring the pasture back to life with lush green grass. The farm was transformed from a place of decay into a sanctuary. Donations poured in from all over the world, from people who had been touched by the story. Elias used the money not for himself, but to establish the Cale Sanctuary, a foundation dedicated to rescuing and caring for other rejected or abused farm animals. Dr. Evans became the sanctuary's lead veterinarian, her initial skepticism replaced by a profound sense of awe. "Cale has taught the veterinary community more than a decade of research papers could," she told a reporter. "He's shown us that the emotional and cognitive lives of these animals are infinitely more complex than we ever imagined. He's not just a bison, he's a pioneer." Years passed. The sanctuary flourished, becoming a haven for dozens of animals who, like Cale, had been deemed worthless by the world. It was a place of healing, a testament to the idea that every life has value. Elias, now well into his 80s, moved more slowly, but his eyes were bright with purpose. He spent his days overseeing the sanctuary, but his favorite moments were the quiet evenings spent with Cale. The great bison was old, his muzzle gray and his movements deliberate, but the bond between him and Elias was stronger than ever. They would often sit together on a small hill overlooking the rebuilt farm, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. They didn't need words. They had a language of their own, A silent communication built on shared history and unconditional love. "You, no big fella," Elias said one evening, his hand resting on Cale's neck. "When I bought you at that auction, they all thought I was a fool. They said I bought a worthless, broken-down old beast for $100. He paused, looking out at the peaceful sanctuary that had risen from the ashes. "But they were wrong. I didn't buy you, you bought me. You bought me for $100, and you gave me back my life. You taught me that things aren't broken. They're just waiting for a little kindness to be made whole again. You didn't just save me from that fire, Cale. You saved me from a life without purpose, without love. You saved my soul." Cale turned his massive head and rested it gently on Elias's shoulder. The old man and the old Bison sat there together as twilight descended. Two survivors who had found in each other the one thing the world could not take away. They were living proof that the greatest treasures are often found in the places others have discarded, and that the most profound acts of heroism can come from the most humble and rejected of hearts. Their story became a timeless legend, a reminder that true worth is not measured in strength or youth or monetary value, but in the boundless capacity of the heart to love, to forgive, and to save. How might our world change if we learned to see the value in every rejected soul, human or animal, and understood that within every broken spirit lies the potential for greatness waiting for just one person to believe in it? The sanctuary, born from ash and cemented by love, entered a golden age. The decade that followed the Great Fire saw the Cale Sanctuary transform from a local legend into a global symbol of hope. The blackened land had healed, now carpeted in a sea of emerald green grass, crisscrossed by fences that were strong but never felt like cages. Dozens of animals found refuge there: a blind horse who had been deemed useless, a herd of sheep rescued from a bankrupt farm, a three-legged coyote who had somehow won Cale's approval and was allowed to live peacefully at the edge of the property, and countless other creatures, each with a story of rejection and redemption. Elias, though his steps were slower and his back more bent, found a youthfulness in his purpose. His days were filled with the quiet rhythms of care, his heart full with the community of souls he had gathered around him. Arthur Davenport, a man reborn from his own trial by fire, was a constant presence, his wealth and business acumen now directed toward managing the foundation, ensuring the sanctuary's future would be as secure as its fences. But the heart of the sanctuary, its quiet, beating center, remained the unshakable bond between the old man and the old Bison. Cale was a patriarch in the truest sense. His immense presence was a calming force that settled disputes among the other animals. He was a living lesson in dignity, a walking embodiment of the sanctuary's core belief. He spent his days grazing peacefully, his dark eyes watching over his diverse herd, a gentle king in his quiet kingdom. His relationship with Elias had deepened into a comfortable, profound silence. They were two halves of the same soul, sharing a history that was etched into the very landscape around them. They had shown the world that love was the most powerful medicine, and for a time, it seemed their work was complete, their lesson taught. But the universe had one final test for them, a challenge so great it would threaten to shatter the very foundations of their philosophy. The call came on a cold autumn morning. It was from Dr. Evans, her voice strained with a weariness Elias had not heard in years. "Elias, we have a situation," she began, "a bad one. The authorities in Wyoming raided an illegal operation, animal fighting. It's horrific. They found a young bison bull. He's the only survivor. They don't know what to do with him. No other facility will take him. He's too aggressive. They're going to have to put him down unless you'll consider taking him." Elias didn't hesitate. "Of course. Bring him here." Dr. Evans paused. "Elias, you don't understand. This isn't like Cale. Cale was broken in spirit. His spirit has been forged into a weapon. He's killed 2 handlers. They call him Cain. He's pure rage on 4 legs. Taking him on might be a mistake, but Elias's belief was absolute. No soul is a mistake, Doc. Every soul is just waiting for a chance. We'll give him that chance. When the reinforced steel transport truck arrived 2 days later, the entire sanctuary seemed to hold its breath. Even from inside the truck, they could hear the violent sounds of the animal within furious bellows, the thunderous crash of his body against the metal walls. When the ramp was lowered, the creature that emerged was a terrifying spectacle. He was younger than Cale, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, but he was a giant. His muscles coiled like thick steel cables beneath a dark, scarred hide. His eyes were not the deep, wise pools of Cale's. They were burning coals of pure, unadulterated fury. His horns were sharp and intact, and he swung his head from side to side, a clear and present danger to everything around him. He charged out of the trailer, not with the confusion of a lost animal, but with the focused intent of a killer. He shattered a temporary wooden barricade with a single, contemptuous toss of his head and let out a roar that sent the other sanctuary animals fleeing in terror. It took 4 experienced handlers with ropes and tranquilizer darts to guide him into the specially prepared quarantine pen, a 1-acre enclosure with 20-foot steel walls that Davenport had insisted on building for just such a contingency. As the gate slammed shut, Cain spun around and charged it, the impact shaking the ground and leaving a dent in the thick metal. He paced the perimeter like a caged demon, his breath pluming in the cold air, his eyes promising violence to any who dared approach. Elias stood and watched, his heart heavy. He had seen broken animals, sad animals, frightened animals. He had never seen an animal that radiated such pure, bottomless hate. From his own pasture half a mile away, Cale had been watching. He had lifted his head at the sound of the truck and had not moved since. He watched the chaos, the fear, the raw aggression of the newcomer. But while the other animals trembled, Cale remained utterly still. His ancient eyes were fixed on the distant, raging bull. He did not show fear. He did not show aggression. He showed only a deep, unwavering, and inscrutable focus, as if he were looking at a puzzle that only he could understand. Have you ever encountered a rage so profound it seemed impossible to overcome, a brokenness so complete that hope itself felt like a foolish indulgence? The days that followed were some of the most difficult the sanctuary had ever known. Cain's rage did not subside. It seemed to feed on itself, growing stronger in his isolation. He systematically tried to destroy his enclosure, charging the walls until his head was bloodied. He refused all attempts at peaceful contact. When handlers brought food, he would wait until they left before eating, and sometimes he would simply destroy the trough in a fit of fury. Elias tried the same technique that had worked with Cale years ago. He sat on a stool outside the steel fence, talking to Cain in a low, calm voice. But Cain was not Cale. He did not respond to the gentle murmurings. Instead, he would charge the fence where Elias sat, crashing against it with a terrifying force. His roars of fury meant to intimidate, to drive the man away. Elias, for the first time in his life, felt a flicker of fear. More than that, he felt a sliver of doubt. His entire philosophy was built on the belief that kindness was the key, that every creature, no matter how damaged, could be reached. Cain was challenging that belief at its very core. "I don't know if we can do this, Elias," Dr. Evans admitted one evening after a particularly violent episode where Cain had nearly broken through a welded seam in the fence. "His psychological trauma is the worst I have ever seen. His aggression is constant, triggered by everything and nothing. He sees every living thing as a threat. The people who did this to him, they didn't just break him. They rewired his very soul for violence. Keeping him here puts everyone and all the other animals at risk. We might have to face the possibility that he is truly a lost cause." Elias felt a deep, chilling sorrow at her words, because a part of him feared she was right. The sanctuary, once a place of unwavering peace, now had an epicenter of violence at its heart. The other animals were perpetually on edge. The staff was stressed and frightened. Even Davenport, the man who had funded the enclosure, began to express his concerns. Elias, our insurance, our liability, our reputation is built on being a place of peace. This animal is a ticking time bomb. How long can we wait for a miracle before he seriously hurts someone? The pressure was immense. Every night, Elias would lie awake, the sound of Cain's restless, angry movements carrying on the wind. He prayed for guidance, for a sign, for a crack in the armor of the young bull's hate. The only thing that gave him a sliver of hope was Cale. The old bison had developed a new routine. Every single day, at sunrise and at sunset, Cale would walk to the edge of his own pasture that was closest to Cain's enclosure. He would stand there for an hour, perfectly still, his massive head oriented toward the raging bull. He never made a sound. He simply watched. Cain, in turn, seemed aware of the old patriarch's presence. At first, he directed his rage at Cale, charging the fence in his direction, roaring his defiance. But Cale never flinched. He never moved. He just absorbed the fury with an unshakable calm, his gaze steady and deep. Over weeks, a subtle change occurred. Cain would still rage, but he would punctuate his fury with moments of stillness, where he would stop and stare back at the silent old bull across the field. It was a standoff of two opposing forces, one of pure, chaotic rage, and the other of pure, immovable peace. Elias watched these silent exchanges with fascination. He started to understand. Cale wasn't just watching. He was communicating something. He was showing Cain a different way to be. He was a living example that great strength did not have to mean great violence. He was a mirror, reflecting not the rage Cain was projecting, but the powerful, dignified bison he could be. "He's talking to him," Elias whispered to Davenport one evening as they watched the two bulls in their silent communion. "I don't know how, but he's getting through in a way we can't." But the progress was infinitesimally slow, and disaster struck before their silent therapy could come to fruition. A sudden violent thunderstorm, much like the one that had cemented the bond between Elias and Cale a decade earlier, rolled in one afternoon. The clap of thunder was like a physical blow. For most animals, it was a signal to seek shelter. For Cain, whose trauma was deeply linked to loud, chaotic sounds from his fighting past, it was a trigger. A primal switch was flipped in his brain. With a bellow that was pure, distilled terror and rage, he launched his full weight against the gate of his enclosure. He had been testing it for weeks, and this time, with the added force of adrenaline-fueled panic, a weld finally gave way. The gate buckled, and Cain was free. Panic erupted. Handlers scrambled, shouting instructions. Alarms blared across the sanctuary. The other animals scattered in terror. Cain, free from his cage but trapped in the prison of his own mind, galloped blindly across the fields, a force of pure destruction. His path of terror led him straight toward the visitors' area, where a young volunteer, a bright-eyed college student named Lily, had been caught out in the open. Lily was one of the few who had held out hope for Cain. She had spent hours talking to him, reading to him, believing that somewhere inside him was a soul worth saving. Now her belief had placed her directly in the path of the tortured animal. She froze, her face pale with terror, as the enraged bison bore down on her. She was trapped against the wall of the main visitor center, with nowhere to run. "Cain, no!" Elias screamed, his old legs pumping as he ran. Knowing he would be too slow, Dr. Evans was fumbling for a tranquilizer rifle, but there wasn't time. It was a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. As the staff and visitors watched in horror, certain they were about to witness a tragedy, Elias made a desperate, heart-stopping decision. He sprinted not toward Cain, but toward Cale's pasture, his hands fumbling with the latch on the gate. "What are you doing?" Davenport shouted, his face ashen. "You can't let him out. They'll kill each other." But Elias wasn't listening. His faith in his old friend was absolute. He swung the gate open. "Cale," he said, his voice a prayer, "go help him. Go show him the way." Cale needed no encouragement. He had been watching the entire scene unfold. He walked out of his pasture not with the urgency of a charge, but with the deliberate, heavy tread of a king approaching his throne. He ignored the panicked humans, his eyes locked on the tense drama unfolding by the visitor's center. He placed himself directly between Cain and the terrified young woman. The two bulls were now face to face, just feet apart. Cain was a whirlwind of panicked rage, snorting, pawing the ground, his body trembling. Cale was a mountain of tranquility, his ancient presence seeming to suck the very chaos out of the air. Cain lowered his head, preparing to charge the only thing that stood in his way. This was it, the ultimate confrontation. The sanctuary held its breath. But Cale did not lower his own head to meet the challenge. He did not prepare for a fight. Instead, he did something utterly unexpected. He turned his massive head slightly to the side, exposing his own neck and his scarred shoulder, the very place where the fire had seared his flesh a decade ago. It was a gesture of complete vulnerability, an act of profound trust in the presence of lethal danger. He then let out a low, deep rumble, the same sound he had made to Elias on the day he had first chosen to live. It was not a sound of dominance, but of shared experience. It was a sound that said, "I see your pain. I have felt pain too. You are not alone." Cain faltered. His forward momentum stopped. His bellowing ceased. He stared at the old bull's exposed neck, at the old, faded scars. His burning eyes, for the first time, showed a flicker of something other than rage. It was confusion. Then, as Cale held his vulnerable position, Cain's trembling slowly subsided. The coiled springs of his muscles began to relax. A great, shuddering breath escaped his lungs, a sound like a sob. He took a hesitant step back, then another. The fire in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a vast, deep, and heartbreaking sorrow. He looked at the old patriarch, and for the first time, he was not seeing a rival or a threat. He was seeing a kindred spirit. He was seeing a path out of the darkness. Slowly, Cale straightened his head and took a deliberate step toward Cain. He reached out and gently touched his nose to the side of the younger bull's face. It was a gesture of acceptance, of forgiveness, of welcome. Cain, the unbreakable, the killer, the lost cause, leaned into the touch and stood perfectly still, allowing the old king to offer him solace. The immediate danger had passed, but the most profound event was just beginning. Cain was not magically cured, his trauma not instantly erased. But the violent, raging fever had broken. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, under Cale's steadying influence, Cain allowed the handlers to guide him back, not to the steel cage of his quarantine, but to a new adjacent pasture, sharing a fence line with Cale. The sanctuary, which had been on the verge of tragedy, was now witness to a quiet miracle. A new routine began. Every day, Cale would spend hours by their shared fence. He became Cain's mentor, his anchor. He taught him not with force, but with example. He taught him the rhythms of peace, the language of the herd, the quiet dignity of a bison's life. Cain's journey of healing would be long, measured in years, not days. There were still moments of anxiety, echoes of his past trauma. But the rage was gone, replaced by a tentative willingness to trust, guided every step of the way by the gentle giant who had faced his fury and offered him only compassion. Elias watched them from his porch, his heart filled with a gratitude so immense it felt like it might burst. He had thought Cale's greatest gift was saving him from the fire. Then he thought it was inspiring the sanctuary. Now he knew the truth. Cale's final, most profound lesson was to show the world that healing is not an endpoint, but a continuous, flowing legacy. The saved, in their own time and in their own way, become the saviors. Cale had not just healed himself. He had learned to heal others. He had passed the torch of his own redemption to the next lost soul, ensuring that the light of hope, first sparked by $100 act of faith at a dusty auction, would never be extinguished. What is the ultimate measure of a life well lived? Perhaps it is not in the battles we win or the struggles we overcome, but in our ability to teach others how to heal their own wounds, creating a ripple effect of compassion that extends far beyond our own time on this earth. That the quiet miracle that unfolded after the storm became the new rhythm of the sanctuary. The relationship between Cale and Cain was a slow, majestic dance of healing, a daily masterclass in the forgotten language of the wild. Cale, in his infinite patience, became Cain's teacher, his guide, his living anchor to a world the younger bull had never been allowed to know. He began with the simplest of lessons. He taught Cain the art of stillness. In his past, for Cain, to be still was to be a target. His life had been a constant, frantic explosion of movement, a desperate attempt to fend off pain. Cale showed him that stillness was not weakness, but a form of strength. He would stand for hours, grazing peacefully, his massive body relaxed, his breathing deep and even. Cain, from his adjacent pasture, would watch, his own muscles twitching with nervous energy. But slowly, day by day, he began to emulate the old patriarch. He learned to stand without pacing, to breathe without snorting in agitation, to simply exist in the moment without the constant anticipation of an attack. It was the first time in his life that peace was not an absence of violence, but a presence of its own. Next, Cale taught him the language of the earth. Cain had been raised in steel pens and dusty, blood-soaked arenas. He knew the smell of fear and adrenaline, but he did not know the scent of an approaching rainstorm on the wind, or the subtle difference between the sweet clover and the tougher buffalo grass. Cale would guide him, through their shared fence, to the best patches of grazing. He would lift his head and test the wind, and Cain, watching intently, would learn to do the same. He was being deprogrammed from a life of man-made horror and reprogrammed into the ancient, instinctual wisdom of his ancestors. The most difficult lesson was trust in humanity. Elias understood that he could not force this. He had to earn it. And he knew Cale would be his ambassador. Every day, Elias would approach the fence line, never getting too close, and just speak to both of them. He told Cain the story of Cale's own rescue, of the fire, of the community they had built. He wanted the young bull to understand that this place was different, that here, a human hand was a source of comfort, not pain. The breakthrough came one crisp morning, months into the routine. Elias brought a bucket of sliced apples, a favorite treat of Cale's. He offered one to Cale, who took it gently from his palm. Then, holding his breath, he extended his hand through a small opening in the fence toward Cain. Cain flinched, his first instinct to pull back, to see the offering as a trick. But then he looked at Cale, who stood calmly beside Elias, chewing his apple with quiet contentment. The old bull's presence was a powerful endorsement, a silent vouching for the old man's character. Cain took a hesitant step forward. He stretched out his neck, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the apple, then Elias's hand. He was trembling, a battle of past trauma and present possibility raging within him. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he gently, so gently, took the apple from Elias's hand. His lips barely brushed the man's skin, a touch as soft as a whisper. Elias felt tears well in his eyes. It was a gesture more powerful than any words, a fragile truce in a long and bitter war. The young volunteer, Lily, who had been nearly trampled, became a crucial part of this process. Healing her own fear, she would come and sit with Elias, her soft voice adding to the chorus of peace. She never tried to touch Cain, but her consistent, gentle presence helped to rewrite his understanding of humans. He began to associate her not with the terror of his rampage, but with the quiet calm that followed. After nearly a year of this patient tutelage, the day came when Dr. Evans and the team agreed it was time for the next step. Cain could not live in isolation forever. If he was truly to be part of the sanctuary, he had to join the herd. The morning of the integration was filled with a quiet, palpable tension. The staff stood at a safe distance, ready with tranquilizer rifles, though they all prayed they would not be needed. Elias walked to the gate that separated the two pastures, his heart pounding. This was the ultimate test of Cale's teaching and Cain's recovery. He looked at Cale, who stood waiting with an air of serene confidence. The old bull seemed to know this day was coming, that it was a necessary part of the journey. Elias swung the heavy gate open, creating a wide-open path between the two worlds. The other animals, the blind horse, the sheep, the rescued dairy cows saw the opening and the dark, imposing figure of Cain on the other side. They remembered his terror. They bunched together, their nervousness a tangible thing. Cale took the first step. He walked through the opening with his slow, regal gait, not even glancing at the other animals. He was the vanguard of peace. He walked a few yards into Cain's old pasture and then stopped, turning his head to look back at his protege. It was a clear invitation. Come, you are ready. Cain stood at the threshold, a black silhouette against the morning sun. Before him lay a vast green field filled with dozens of other creatures. It was a world of complex social interactions, of freedom and vulnerability he had never known. The instinct to retreat to the familiar safety of his pen was strong. He took a half-step back, his anxiety rising. But Cale let out a low, soft rumble. It was not a command, but a reassurance. I am here. You are not alone. Cain took a deep breath and placed one hoof across the threshold, then another. He was in. He walked with his head held low, his body tense, every nerve on high alert. A young lamb, startled by his sudden appearance, bleated and bolted away. Cain flinched violently, his muscles coiling, an echo of his old rage threatening to surface. His head came up, a defensive snort escaping his nostrils. The entire herd froze, anticipating an explosion. But before the rage could take hold, Cale was there. He simply walked to Cain's side, his massive body brushing against the younger bull's. A simple physical reminder of his presence. He broke the circuit. Cain's tension dissipated, replaced by the calming influence of his mentor. He relaxed his posture and followed Cale's lead. The integration was a success. For the first few weeks, Cain was Cale's shadow. He stayed at the edge of the herd, never straying more than a few feet from his teacher. He learned the social cues, who to give a wide berth to, how to approach the water troughs without causing alarm. He was an apprentice of peace, and Cale was his tireless master. He was learning not just how to live, but how to belong. If you believe that every soul deserves a second chance and that patience and love can heal the deepest wounds, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. The world needs more reminders that what is broken can be mended. As the seasons turned, Cain's confidence grew. He began to find his own place within the herd's complex society. While Cale was the undisputed, peaceful king, Cain, with his youth and immense power, became the unofficial guardian. His presence alone was a deterrent to any potential threat. He had transformed from the sanctuary's greatest liability into its fiercest protector. This new role was put to the test one evening at dusk. The sky was a blaze of orange and purple, and a quiet peace had settled over the fields. Cale, feeling the weariness of his many years, was resting under his favorite oak tree, his great body still and relaxed. Elias was on the porch, watching. the beautiful end to a peaceful day. He didn't see the pair of shadows detaching themselves from the distant tree line. A pair of large, feral dogs, lean and hungry, had been drawn to the sanctuary. They were not wolves or cougars, but they were a significant threat to the smaller animals, especially the flock of sheep grazing near the far fence. The dogs were skilled hunters moving with a silent, coordinated purpose. They slunk low to the ground, using the tall grass as cover, their eyes fixed on a young lamb that had strayed from its mother. Cain was the first to notice. His head shot up from his grazing, his nostrils testing the air. He caught the scent of the predators, a scent that triggered a deep, primal memory of conflict. The old Cain would have exploded in a blind, chaotic rage, but this was the new Cain. This was Cale's student. His first instinct was not to charge, but to assess. He scanned the field, his intelligent eyes quickly locating the threat and the intended victim. He looked across the field to his mentor. Cale was already beginning to rise, alerted by Cain's sudden change in posture. Their eyes met across the dusky field in a moment of silent understanding. The student was ready. Cain did not roar. He did not rampage. He moved with a focused, controlled power that was even more terrifying. He galloped across the field, his hooves thundering on the soft earth, and placed his immense body directly between the hungry dogs and the terrified sheep. He lowered his head not to charge, but as a clear, unmistakable warning. He let out a deep, resonant bellow that was not a cry of rage, but a declaration of protection. It was the voice of a guardian, a sovereign defending his realm. The feral dogs, confronted by nearly a ton of determined, unbluffing bison, skidded to a halt. They had expected an easy meal, not a confrontation with a creature of such power and focus. As they hesitated, Cale arrived, moving with his slow, unstoppable momentum. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Cain. They were a united wall of power, one representing ancient wisdom, the other representing redeemed strength. The two bison stood their ground, a silent, immovable force. The dogs, their hunt broken, their courage failed, turned and melted back into the shadows from whence they came. The flock of sheep, safe and unharmed, bleated their relief. The other animals in the herd, who had watched the entire event with rapt attention, now looked at Cain differently. The last vestiges of their fear were replaced by an open respect. He had not just protected the herd. He had protected them from his own past, channeling his immense power not into destruction, but into defense. He had truly earned his place among them. From his porch, Elias watched with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. He was witnessing the completion of a circle, the fulfillment of a promise. Cale had not just saved one life. He had created a legacy of healing that was now alive and breathing in his successor. Cain, the bull bought by rage and forged in violence, had been reborn through love, now standing as a testament to the sanctuary's deepest truth. The torch had been passed. Cale's greatest act was not in surviving the fire, but in teaching another how to rise from his own ashes. The years that followed were a testament to the quiet, enduring power of that legacy. The sanctuary thrived under the watchful eyes of its two great patriarchs. Cale, in his advancing age, became the sanctuary's soul, a living library of wisdom and peace. Cain, in his prime, became its body, the strong protector who ensured that the peace Cale embodied was never threatened. They were a perfect balance, a living symbol of the sanctuary's journey from a single act of desperate faith to a flourishing haven of redemptive love. The bond between them was the quiet, steady heartbeat of the entire community. They were rarely far from each other, a picture of tranquil strength that calmed every creature in their presence. Elias, now approaching his 90th year, found his greatest joy in simply watching them, his heart full. The end for Cale came as peacefully as he had lived his final years. It was a warm summer afternoon, the air thick with the scent of sweetgrass and sun-baked earth. He had been growing weaker for weeks, his immense energy finally beginning to wane. He lay down beneath his favorite oak tree, the same one that had sheltered him on his first day at the sanctuary. He was not in pain. He was simply tired, his long, incredible journey reaching its gentle conclusion. A profound stillness fell over the sanctuary, as if every animal understood the significance of the moment. One by one, the other creatures, the blind horse, the dairy cows, the flock of sheep walked over and formed a wide, silent circle around the great oak. They were not there out of morbid curiosity, but out of a deep, instinctual reverence for their dying king. Cain was the last to approach. He walked with the same deliberate, powerful grace he now always carried. He was the undisputed leader of the herd, the guardian, but as he approached his mentor, he was once again the humble student. He stood over Cale, his massive head lowered. He did not show panic or distress, but a deep, solemn understanding. He had learned Cale's final lesson, that death, like life, could be met with dignity and peace. He gently nudged Cale's shoulder, a final, tender gesture of farewell, and then stood vigil, his powerful body a shield against any disturbance. Elias sat on his porch, watching the sacred scene unfold through a blur of tears. He did not feel the sharp sting of loss he had felt with Martha. This was a different kind of grief, a gentle sorrow interwoven with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had been given the profound gift of witnessing a life that had been written off as worthless transform into a force that healed dozens of others and changed an entire community. Cale drew one last long, peaceful breath and was still. His great heart, which had endured so much pain and given so much love, was finally at rest. As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the field, Cain let out a low, resonant rumble. It was not a cry of mourning, but a call to the herd. It was the sound of a leader accepting his mantle. He had taken his master's place. Elias looked at the scene, at Cain, now the calm center of the sanctuary, at the diverse family of souls living in peace, and he understood. Cale was not truly gone. He was in the strength and gentleness of Cain. He was in the trust of the blind horse. He was in the green grass that grew from the ashes. He was in the heart of every life he had touched. Elias had spent $100 on a rejected animal, and in return, he had been shown the undeniable truth that love is the only thing in the universe that does not die. It merely changes form, passed on from one grateful soul to the next forever. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.